to start this episode with like a Hulk smash.
So if you're watching via video, you will notice we have stands now.
We do.
Which is going to be so nice.
Have we actually like said it on the recordings about how uncomfortable it is to hold the microphone?
I don't think that we have.
Okay, well, it's really uncomfortable to hold these microphones and our hands cramp every time.
And every time we'd have like indentions on our hands just from like squeezing. And I'm glad that we do have some new stands coming that are going to be even more like professional, because we're professional podcasters now. That those are going to be fun, but we're going to have to figure out what to do with our hands, because this at least we can hold on to our stand like we're Hannah Montana.
That's true.
Whereas when we have the little ones that dangle, we're just going to be like,
we're gonna need
the Italian.
We need to do like a fidget of the day or something. Well, that makes sense though, because you'll be Hannah and I'll be Miley with the hair color.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I'm here for it.
It's the best of both worlds.
Well, welcome back to Couch Convos, the podcast where we kind of peel back the curtain on mental health, talk about all things feelings, coping, and just realistic life in the real world.
Yeah. And today is an interesting one. And we discussed how we were going to do this one specifically, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Yes.
So
today we will be talking about feminine rage. And I will say that this was not the topic that we were going to do for this podcast episode. I don't even remember which.
Was it? No, we did self-care and self-love.
Was it like the rules we break as therapists?
Maybe that was
like that?
It was going to be something like that.
Well, that changed. So the whole idea behind this podcast came from, I went to breakfast with one of my really good friends who I've known since college. She's arguably one of the best people I know. She's brilliant. And without talking too much about her identifying details, she works in finance and is in a position of like leadership and manages other people. And we just got to like catching up. We were like literally having brunch together, and we we're catching up about how she was doing and about work and about her friends too, who are also equally as brilliant. And some of them are in like the STEM fields. And we really started talking about the things that make our blood boil in the respective fields that we're in. And I left that breakfast and I was just like filled with, I actually search on Spotify for a playlist that's called Feminine Rage just to kind of let it out after.
Well, and I think there's a song called Feminine Rage, because I was Googling, and I think it's by Peggy, maybe.
Okay.
But it was
I love that.
entitled Feminine Rage. I did not listen to it because I was like, I don't need to skew my vision before we go into this.
Yeah.
But I was like, that's interesting. So anger.
Yes.
As a therapist, of course, we have ways that we like talk about anger, coping skills for anger. But as Sarah, who like, we are very authentic and transparent on this show. Like, we're not always in our therapist brains.
No.
Especially when it comes to our own feelings sometimes.
Correct.
So with Sarah anger, what do you do? What do you do with it?
Anger is a tough one for me. I've always been really slow to get angry. I think I have like one of two reactions. One, which I don't like, I cry. When I get really angry, sometimes I'll cry, which I'll get to later, is seen as like a weakness, which just makes my blood boil more. Or I actually faint, like just because of having POTS. Like if I get super angry, I will get really faint. And so when I was younger, I did faint while having a temper tantrum. Like obviously POTS wasn't talked about when I was little.
Right.
I actually didn't realize it till I was much older, of like, oh my gosh, like she wasn't just kind of faking it being a toddler. So I will say that anger now is very similar to those two reactions, but I think now I internalize it a lot. If I'm not comfortable in this space, I get really quiet. I just get really quiet. I kind of just lock up because I don't want to say something I don't mean. But if I'm with like my comfort person or people, or mainly like my spouse, I let it fly. And that's actually something I'm trying to work on. Like, it's not fair to only express anger to one person in that way, but I'd say that's how I express it for sure. What about you?
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely a crier too. I cry about all things.
Do you like being a crier when you're mad?
Oh, I hate it.
Yeah,
I will
like
even sometimes, if I'm like talking with someone angrily and I start to cry and I'm angry at them, I'm like, I'm not crying because I'm sad. I'm crying because I'm mad at
this
you.
This is not a weakness, I
promise. So I definitely cry and my face turns really red, like bright red. So it is not possible for me to hide my anger most times. I try and internalize it and like try and calm myself down, but people know right away because also my face. I talk a lot with my face.
You do.
Which I've tried to work on.
I love that about you. But
thank you.
I really do.
Because like it's written all over me. But as far as like what I do with it, I usually try and like bottle it up for a hot minute because I'm like, okay, I need to be patient. I need to have grace. I need to have all these things, and then I'll get in my car and by myself. I'll just have like a monologue vent session.
I love that. Or I'll pick a friend and I'll like send them a text and I'll be like, hey, I'm about to send you some voice memos.
Yep.
You don't even have to listen to them if you don't want to, but buckle
Get
up.
ready. Yeah, I definitely have, the people that I vent to, but I don't always want to go to them because that brings a lot on them. And so sometimes I'm like, you know what? I just need to manage this on my own. So I'll get in my car and I'll just like scream.
I love it.
Or I just have like these whole conversations with myself.
Sure.
And then I pretend like I'm in that convo. I'm like, and this, and then this, and then afterwards I'm like, okay, I felt like I talked about it. But when I am in like the moment, and it's typically with my partner. Yep. Love him to death. However, he definitely takes the brunt of when I have kept all of it. He's my pop off person, and I just like I'm quick. Like once I hit that level, there's like no bringing me back down until I've gotten it out.
I feel like I'm very similar with my person as well. Yeah, which is hard.
It is hard, and we're sorry. We apologize.
We do.
We do our best.
They're very great people.
They are. They're great people, and really the only people that could just like handle us so well. And that's why they are our people.
We really should have them on the couch. Like if we just took the day and have the two of them on this couch and have a podcast together one day about being with a therapist.
Yeah. I'm sure they would have lots to say.
I'm here for it. So catch that soon. We're going to commit them to it without even asking apparently. But I'm here for it.
Yeah.
So I will say that like, and I think in the context of this, and obviously the title will be something along the lines of feminine rage. Anyone can experience feminine rage. Yeah. And I do think that we really need to talk about the stigma behind rage. And the more I really got to talking to people about this topic, the more I realized that I actually didn't think that there was any person who felt like rage was safe for them to express. Because if you think about, like, obviously we are two white women, we would be called a Karen. Yeah. Or like whiny, or I can't say the word, or else we'd have to change our settings on podcast platforms. But it would be like a female dog. Right. So that's how we would be interpreted. But like, I'm thinking about like if a white man was expressing rage, like I know like my own spouse, if he's feeling angry, he makes sure to change his volume so that I'm not afraid. So he could be seen as like scary, or some people call it like a Chad, and like mansplaining. Or like a black woman being seen as aggressive, and a black man being seen as like threatening and dangerous. And so I really got to thinking of there's truly no person I feel like that is feeling safe. We could argue people that could, but I do think at the end of the day, we've reached a point systemically where like rage just isn't allowed, which is kind of odd, because the more I got to talking to people about this concept, the more I realized how much we truly internalize things, which is just a lot to really unpack. So just for a general disclaimer, when we're talking about feminine rage, we talk about it because we are both female and we are both feminine females, and however you are, if you're a male, female, anything in between, you have masculine and feminine traits. You can all experience feminine rage, but at the end of the day, this is about rage itself.
Yeah, in general, because it attacks all of us.
It does.
All of us. And like, it's time for us to attack it. No, but I feel like anger is one of those emotions that we're like, oh, you need to calm down before you can talk to me. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. First of all, we know never to say calm down to anyone who is not calm.
That causes me rage.
Yeah, for sure. But as valid as it is, anger is a secondary emotion.
It is.
And a lot of people are like, well, what does that mean? So when we look at anger, it is like an iceberg.
The anger iceberg.
The anger iceberg.
Every therapist ever is like, yeah.
Okay, we've heard it. But it's like one of my faves, especially with kids, because they're like, oh, like I had no idea. So with an iceberg, of course, the smallest part of the berg is actually on top of the water, right? Like, so, and it's what we can see, whereas underneath is actually the largest part of the iceberg, which, you know, a lot of people don't recognize. That's how the Titanic sank.
I was about to say, the Titanic learned that lesson real quick.
She did. But, you know, we look at it as there's always something up under our anger.
Yeah.
Anger typically comes second. And so part of like mental health and therapy is like looking up what is under that. And a lot of times for me, I know specifically, it's usually like hurt or embarrassment.
Like insecurity, not feeling good enough, or just like feeling misunderstood as a whole. Just that frustration. So for the purposes of this episode, we are going to break down rage and feminine rage, and we will break it down into 3 categories, and that is internal rage. So rage we just feel all by our lonesome, and then interpersonal, so things that are with other people, and then also systemic rage. And to prep for this episode, we actually asked our social media following. If you're not following us, please give us a follow at Soul Haven Counseling or at Couch Convos the Pod on Instagram. Also Soul Haven Counseling on Facebook, Soul Haven Counseling on TikTok,
YouTube, Shorts, which I didn't even know was a thing until recently. I didn't know what YouTube Shorts were, but
right. Well, if you want to continue to contribute to the podcast, give us a follow on any of those platforms. But we actually asked our audience about what causes you to feel rage. And so in these 3 categories of internal, interpersonal, and systemic, we will include all of the responses that we got from our followers and from some of the people in our personal lives too. Definitely is a big range, but I think that it's really cool to see different perspectives.
Yeah. So internal rage, our submitted responses were not feeling respected, feeling like you're not enough, outgrowing relationships once you've invested in yourself.
It's a big one.
Pumping and or breastfeeding. Being told to not settle while you're in your 20s, but in your 30s being told that you're too picky and that's why you're alone. That one, like, I read that. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever thought of that, but it's 100% true.
Yeah.
And then let's see, women who are bettering themselves, growing their careers, balancing work life, working on mental health, while men cruise through life and often don't self-improve. And then arm workouts, doing your hair.
So obviously, like, these responses are across a very wide range. And while we read these responses, you are going to tell that certain responses are pointed in a certain direction in terms of opinion, stance, things like that. This podcast episode is not meant to be essentially a roast on any certain person or viewpoint at all. This podcast is to affirm, regardless of where you stand, you will feel rage, because the same person who feels frustrated that women are bettering themselves while men cruise through life is very valid. That could also be mirrored by a man who feels like maybe he has to better himself in a way that's seen as invisible by a woman, because a lot of men don't talk about bettering themselves sometimes, things like that. So just know that when we're really talking about these different responses, we will take the stance of acknowledging their rage, because, you know, they're not on the couch with us, and we really need to make space for the fact that that's their story, and we can affirm it and then just process the emotions that come up as a result.
Yeah, validating perspective. Yes. Perspective is important.
Absolutely. So internal rage, that is one that I do feel like I'm the worst at, truthfully. Because I'm really good with, like, you know, if I'm working with someone else, if they're systemic, I feel like there's always like a next step in my head, but it's that internal rage that I feel like is the one that like sticks with me, I guess, a little bit more. That's like the most powerlessness, I guess.
Yeah, no, I can look at that one, and that's when I start using that negative self-talk of I need to get over it.
Yes.
Because it's like all on me, right? It's like, well, I'm feeling this feeling. No one else can control my feelings, so I just need to get over it.
Or it's this idea of like, okay, if I'm having this like anger or rage, I'm just being dramatic or I'm being too much and I need to control my reaction to something.
Which I read something on Pinterest. I love Pinterest. And it said your first thought is what you've been trained to believe, and your second thought is who you want to be. And so like that first thought of, oh, I'm just being dramatic, or oh, I just need to get over it. I like to always sit with that and be like, okay, what from my life told me that that's the case? And then the thought that I have afterwards, I'm going to latch on to that one and come up with like, okay, this is how I want to be. This is how I want to process this.
Yeah.
So I know that like a lot of internalized rage can cause a lot of people pleasing.
Yes, absolutely. Things like depression, anxiety, also like health implications too. I know I feel like I mention it offhandedly in every episode,
as we should,
which I do feel like we have to have our own episode on like health-based consequences. But internalized rage really will manifest in your body. Like I know for me, like I know you mentioned that your face gets red. My heart goes absolutely wild. Like my heart rate will spike like crazy, which of course then like triggers fainting. Or you have a response like fainting. I know some people when they get really mad, like they vomit. Like our bodies will release these feelings or store it however it needs to. So I do feel like we definitely should be addressing rage internally if we have it, because you deserve to not let it get stored and locked up.
Yeah. And then that also brings in like self-criticism, guilt, shame, all of those. And if we are just having these conversations in our head all the time, like we're not hearing anything differently. And I think that's the important part of being able to like connect with like community, either whether that's like a therapist or a friend, a parent, a partner, whoever that looks like for you, being able to hear the outside of like, no, those feelings are valid. You don't have to push those away because they don't really go away. And it just like starts to build upon that view of ourselves.
Well, and I'm even thinking about the submitted responses, and I'm like looking at them here, and I'm thinking about the person who submitted pumping and breastfeeding and the rage that they potentially feel with that. And I think about so many of these things, and I'm imagining this person alone and doing something so absolutely incredible like breastfeeding, which is an incredible thing if that's what you choose to do. But experiencing that rage and then shame, it just seems so isolating. And I can see how it almost leads to that dissociation of, well, I quote unquote should be doing this, or I want to be doing this, but I feel anger about it, which then caused me to feel guilt.
Yeah.
And then like you're an imposter.
That, and then like being like, I don't want to have these feelings. So then you numb yourself to them of, you know, I'm just not going to feel anything about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that can carry on into other areas of life. You know, like we are a whole. We are not just separate events. Things come together. And so sitting with that, it might be like, you know what, I'm kind of over this. I'm just not going to care about it. And then causes us to numb ourselves to the positives as well.
And it's like the response of like being told to not settle in your 20s and like be picky and play the field, but then in your 30s you're penalized for that, all because of a calendar is changing. And then I think that brings up this idea of like you're never enough no matter what you do, because if in your 20s, if you settle in your 20s, you're wasting time or you're rushing things. But then if you settle in your 30s and beyond, you're too picky and you've waited for too long. So I feel like so much of this internalized rage leads to this feeling of like, no matter what I do, it's not going to be enough. And no matter what I do, it's just not acceptable anymore. So you're right. Like it does have that numbing and dissociative element, but I do think it's also universal. It seems like, and as I asked people in my personal life about this topic, I realized just how much people are battling internally. Doesn't matter how great things can be going in their life, there's always something going on.
So next one, interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
So interpersonal rage, that's between two people or a group of people. Friendship, partners, parents, all the things.
Yes. And so the responses we got for this one were when people cancel plans last minute just because they don't feel like going. I have been guilty of this one. For sure.
It's hard, especially if you're an introvert.
Yeah. People not doing their jobs. I could agree with that one. Pretending your relationship is like better than it is. So kind of just like falsifying your relationship and seeing it through rose colored glasses to the point where it's not authentic. The one-uppers.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Yes. And then the just wait until comments.
Which I've gotten a lot of this from recent moms.
Yeah.
Or people trying to become mothers. Is a lot of it's like the projection of that too. And it's like, God, that's already a scary process.
Yes. Well, I do feel like it's a lot of women who are the just wait until. And it's like, I understand. The thing is, like, we don't understand. And actually, I heard it when we were planning our wedding too.
Yeah.
Like, well, just wait until this happens or just wait until that happens. And there was part of me that was, I remember hearing a lot of those comments and thinking, I think you're coming from a place of care.
Yes.
And wanting to shield me from future harm. But do you understand that by using just wait until statements, you're actually taking from my joy and you're taking the excitement away from this process? Yeah. There's so many better ways to frame, like, hey, do you feel ready? Or like, how are you doing? Do you feel equipped to handle any challenges ahead? Or like, oh, like, I wish I had known these things, or I wish I did this to prepare, or just, I don't know. The just wait until, I feel like that's a lot. And a lot of women in their 20s and 30s experience that.
Yeah. That transition
period.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
Yes. And then potty training with toddlers. Oh, negotiating with a toddler is like Stockholm syndrome. I do it fairly regularly with my nephew. This is a really fun one. Not knowing what Skibbity Toilet Riz, Ohio is.
I'm telling you.
These kids.
The things I learned from these children, I'm like, I don't understand what you're talking about,
but that's where the rage comes from.
Yes.
I mean, what we talk about? We would say, like, what did we even say?
We always would say like cannon or neck yourself, which that one has apparently come back, and I was
or
like,
that's hot, because Paris Hilton.
Did
that. I was like, that's hot. Swag.
Oh God, there was another one. Oh, it was like ham or something. Like going ham.
Yeah,
there it is.
But I feel like, and maybe this is just like generationally, we just don't understand, and that's fine. But where I get this interpersonal rage sometimes is, I don't see the logic behind Skibbity Toilet Riz.
Yeah, and I know what Riz means.
Yes.
And I know Skibbity Toilet is a YouTube show thing, but with what does it mean? But it doesn't make sense in my brain.
And then why is Ohio at the end?
Right. The Ohio,
why we gotta bring
Ohio
into
this?
Random.
That's just to confuse us.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the last one we got, which is a complete departure from Skibbity Toilet Riz, Oklahoma, is weaponized incompetence, which I also really would agree with. So basically, like, avoiding and like intentionally deflecting responsibility, and kind of using that as a manipulation tactic. So a lot of that interpersonal rage is big, and like even just like reading the responses the whole time, I was like, I either could relate or like I could absolutely see that.
Yeah. And so like this affects like conflicts between people, causing conflicts, or causing feeling like you're not able to manage conflict, boundary violations, people pleasing, burnout. That one goes straight into my heart. And then like resentment. And a lot of times this is always happening like under the surface, because we think like, oh, you know, it's just like one event, two events, but these build on top of each other. And then at some point you're like, why am I so angry with this situation or this person? It's like, well, because you've been letting this build for a hot minute. And it's like, well, I don't want to cause an even bigger issue, but in your heart, something's going on there.
Right. Well, and especially like interpersonally, I feel like it just leads to such unhealthy attachments. But of course, if someone has attachment-based trauma, this is highly triggering and highly activating. Or this could create attachment-based trauma too. Just because if interpersonally things are not lining up, we're not communicating clearly and effectively, or someone's not having an easy time finding their voice, it almost creates this power differential in relationships and in conversations too. Like when the child says, Skibbity Toilet Riz, and then they laugh at me, I don't experience rage, especially if it's my client.
Right.
I just kind of laugh, and it's like, yeah, I know, and I usually say, I know I'm old. But it does create this like sometimes like superiority complex a little bit of like, I know something that you don't. Or especially if it's like, let me look at the other responses. If it's like potty training or the one-uppers, again, in all of those situations, it's creating a power dynamic. Like when my nephew is potty training, I didn't potty train him. I'm not his parent. I was just spectating sometimes. What he thought was right, there was no convincing him otherwise. Also, because developmentally, like, that is sadly appropriate. But again, in his mind, he is on a higher platform than his parents and being potty trained. And also the one-uppers is they have experience and knowledge that they believe could be helpful, but by using those statements, it causes someone to feel less than. So I think that so much of this interpersonal rage comes from feeling like you are on a lesser space in a power dynamic, which is so hard to be in.
Right. And then that naturally puts our body into a state of fight or flight.
Yep.
So we talk about like our fear responses, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fib. All brought, I know.
How'd you say that without stumbling? I'm so
I say it so often now. And I learned that one in school, actual school counseling. But we're constantly, our central nervous system is constantly trying to figure out like how to manage itself. And I love the this is kind of off topic, but kind of on topic. The videos of the sleep study people, how they'll look at how you sleep. And noticing, I saw one last night in like T-Rex arms. If you sleep with T-Rex arms, it's like you're protecting yourself because you don't trust others while you're sleeping.
Yeah, that would make sense.
That's your body in fight, right? Like of getting ready to post up, protect yourself. And so that can cause like issues with trusting other people. Back to that like resentment. Maybe you feel like you pop off more or you're like more, you know, readily available to shut down when like, in a relationship.
Even being passive aggressive. I can see that happening a lot. And I'm probably guilty of doing that myself of like, hearing like the one-uppers and it's like, oh, okay. Things like that. But so when we are in a space where we're feeling that like interpersonal rage, I do think that obviously getting your space into more regulated in terms of where your body's at first is always really helpful. Also so that you can tap under that rage too of like, why is it that I had this reaction and this response? It's not for you to calm down. It's for you to remove that top layer of anger and rage to really access what's underneath it. So we're not calming down, we're opening up the feeling. Actually, we're peeling it back. And I think that it really just helps give clarity and also understand if there are certain relationships that are no longer serving us too, or if it's a great relationship that we love that needs to be redirected, or maybe a boundary needs to be set.
Because we all know when we are in those disagreements or when we're in a moment in a relationship, it's like we are feeling like we're unable to respond because either our thoughts are going a million miles a minute or we're way too turned up that we just are like, I know whatever I'm going to say is just going to come out and it's not going to be what I want. That's because it turns like our lizard brain on of like, I got to survive. I can't even think through this perfectly and then process what I actually want to say and how to say it and use I statements and the technique, feedback technique and all the things. And you're just like, nee. So like one thing is to regulate first. Relate next and then to reason last. The 3 R's, and this should be on our Instagram. I believe it's on there.
It is.
It's
a great graphic.
It's a beautiful graphic, a little upside down triangle. But that regulate part is so important to be able to close that top of our brain so that we're not in lizard brain fight or flight. And able to like carry on a conversation with that person.
Absolutely. And so much of this interpersonal rage stems from the internal rage. And I know we talk about a lot of like hurt people. It's very true. Usually if there is a conflict where there is a statement made or something is happening, it typically says something more about the speaker's own feelings and where they're at than our own self or the relationship. So potentially if there's like a one-upper in a conversation, they might be experiencing a lot of insecurity. And that could be making them feel less than. And to maybe overcompensate for that, they're wanting to kind of show that maybe like, oh, I do have a lot of things happening in my calendar. I am successful, because there's the fear of being not enough. And so I think that as we start to kind of peel back these layers on rage, we just see that at at the end of the day, like, people are just trying to feel like they're enough, but it's getting lost in translation and it ends up harming someone else or ourselves in the process.
Yeah. So like a lot of what we might work on in the therapy room would be something like practicing assertive boundaries and boundary setting. And if you need a podcast on that, we also have that. If you just scroll up a little bit, I think it's like two or three, something like that. So. Yeah. So setting boundaries with, those people. Yeah. And, that might look differently for every person. Even the person that you're talking to, as well as like who you are as a person, as well as like getting into your own childhood, your own past traumas, the things that, what interpersonal relationships look like for you in the past and how that's like affecting you now, as well as how you feel that you should respond. So just kind of like diving into past experiences and like what that looks like for you now.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that leads us into our third section of rage, which is systemic rage. So when we talk about this, it is all about the systems that are built, created, or that are naturally in the world around us. So obviously, like, when we are making this episode, we are in a time of a lot of divide in the country that we're in. So obviously, like, we are in Georgia in the US in 2025. So depending on where you're listening or when you're listening, that could change. But when we're talking about these systemic feelings of rage, it is like directly in this moment right now. And I think the context is really important for this one.
Yeah. Okay, so submitted responses. Men who tried to explain why women shouldn't be upset about reproductive rights. People who don't believe survivors when they speak up about domestic violence. People not understanding how women are constantly on high alert about safety. The pink tax. Having to spend extra time to look, quote unquote, presentable. The income gap and women being given admin work, note-taking, party planning, etc. that has nothing to do with their jobs. Not being taken seriously as female business owners, and then the healthcare system.
I gotta be honest, I added the one about not being taken seriously as
I was wondering if that was you. I was like, ooh, that one hits.
Yes. Yeah. And obviously, like, we won't be disrespectful at all in this case, but there were multiple situations where, like, I remember neither of us felt respected or taken seriously at all when we were opening this business. And honestly, still it happens. It happens quite often, actually. So that rage is there.
Yeah, it definitely is. So all extremely valid. And of course we said, we're not on this podcast to take sides of any kind. No. This is more to just say, like, hey, those feelings are valid to each and every one of our perspectives and our circumstances, because all of those look differently.
They do. And the thing is, and I know people talk about it a lot, like, being a therapist in therapy is political. It is a political career, and we can't run from that, especially because, like, that is valid. Like, we are part of the healthcare system that causes people rage. I literally just submitted an appeal to my own healthcare company this morning because they denied coverage for something that I deem kind of necessary for life. And so I think when we're talking about these things for our clients, I'm typically an open book about where I stand on things involving systems, because that dynamic in the room, if a client has a question about where I stand, in order for them to feel safe, I do think it's clinically appropriate to have that conversation. But we're not in that setting. Like, we're on a podcast right now. So just know that if you're listening to this to gain insight from therapists, know that the way that we're discussing systemic rage right now is different than how we would process it in a therapy session. Because I do think that as a client, like, if you do want to know where your therapist stands on some of these things, you can ask them. If they don't want to answer, they're trained to know what to do in that situation and how to answer it so that you don't break your trust with each other, or they will answer. So just like Caroline said, in these moments, we aren't going to make comments on the particular stances that are made, because that actually goes against the ethics of our license. Like, it literally goes against what we're supposed to be doing as therapists, and it could jeopardize our license to practice. But we do affirm that rage exists, because I read all of these things and I said, I either have this rage or I understand why it's there. So that's just kind of our caveat for systemic based rage that I do think is important. We are ethical providers at the end of the day, and that's our priority here.
Yes. And recognizing that when we are sitting in the room with you, though we do have our own experience and our own beliefs and our own thoughts, that, like, we are not the one that's important in that room. Like, this is for you. You are the one that's important. Right. So, like, we are here literally to be there and validate you and to help you through these situations and these circumstances. So if you ask and if they say something that is different than what you believe, it's totally fine to be like, hey, that makes me uncomfortable. Yeah. And y'all can have a conversation about that.
Well, and I think that, like, when we think about systemic rage, obviously, like, we were just coming out of an election year and we were just had an inauguration. I don't know about you, but, like, I have clients who exist who voted for both candidates. And, like, I obviously know who I voted for. So there are some clients I aligned with and some clients I didn't. But I think that it's important to know that, and I even remember back in 2020, and I was practicing in Rome, same thing happened. Yeah. I worked with families who thought differently than me, and I worked with families who thought the same as me. So I think it's important to know that we are in a world of divide right now. We live in a world, at least in this country, where it's almost encouraged to be on the polar ends of things, and to be very clear in where we stand. I do feel like sometimes gray area thinking isn't encouraged in a lot of these different subjects. But that's where we exist as therapists, is in the gray. And so for this, just know that I feel like I can confidently say at this point, after working with clients and working with people who do exist on all of those different ends, systemic rage exists regardless. Systemic rage does not discriminate based on your ideals on these things. It'll just look a little bit different. So just know that if you're feeling like you're the only one who's angry, you're not. You're not at all. That doesn't take away from how you're feeling. But you're not alone. And so just know that, again, this is not a solo occasion and occurrence.
Yeah. So with that, like, that might look like burnout.
So much burnout.
Activism fatigue. Feeling like your morals and your values are being attacked or changed even, which could be very scary.
Absolutely.
If you're raised a certain way and you're like, oh, wait a minute. That feels different than what I feel right now. As well as, like, helplessness. Because there are so many systems set in place that seem like they are so far away to just, like, grasp. Even looking at things like with running a business, I'm like, God, I wish I could change that. It's like, that is a lot.
Yeah, sometimes I'm like, that stuff didn't sit well with me.
Yeah. And then, like, that existential dread of, when will it ever be something that I feel comfortable with? When will I feel comfortable?
That's a hard wormhole.
Safe? Yeah. Those kinds of things, as well as bringing up, like, trauma, PTSD.
Yeah.
Just a bunch of fear. A lot of fear-based responses in this one.
And I feel like what makes this category different is with systemic rage, sometimes it doesn't seem like there's an end to it. And something like internal rage is we can manage it on the spot almost instantly. Interpersonal, we can choose when we attack it. Systemic rage is something that causes so many feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness, like you said, because it's like, okay, hold on, I'm one person experiencing this rage, and of course others more than likely have the same feelings too. But there's this idea of, well, when is it going to end? If we've already gotten ourselves here, is there ever a relief to this suffering? And like you said, I think activism fatigue, I actually didn't know about it until recently. And I thought it was really affirming to see, especially as therapists do. Like, we're constantly being advocates for something. Even if we're not, we're still doing it, which I'm realizing now. And I think it also shows that, like, when we are in a system that's meant to be a little bit more divisive, and there's conflicting views and there's aligning views all the time, having to fight or prove or disprove all the time will cause that fatigue and burnout very quickly, especially when in the media right now, there's something new every day, almost every hour, I feel like.
And with this, you know, this can cause other areas of rage or breakdown. Like, I know with systemic rage specifically, that's tying a lot into interpersonal.
You can fight with
conflict.
So many people.
And what that looks like, which then turns into like individual, because then you're like, oh, well, I just, you know, lost that relationship because of this, and that's not what I wanted. And so, like, recognizing that all of these can be separate, or they can build off of one another, and then, like, add to.
Right.
So what do we do? do we do about it?
Well, I think, like you said, acknowledging like the top down and bottom up from all of these things. Like, I think that it's been really clear kind of separating it in these ways. We can see how starting individually can lead to a systemic rage, and then vice versa. Starting systemically, then you can kind of trickle that into your relationships, and then that leads you to question your own identity and yourself. So I think with that, first of all, especially with systemic rage, thinking about your action plan. And I always like to resource clients with this one. That's some of the times where I wish that I had a social work background.
Yeah.
Because I feel like social workers are amazing at doing this.
Connecting. Yeah.
Yes. And it's figuring out, okay, where are you going to find community? So, because the byproduct of systemic rage so often is isolation and loneliness and that powerlessness that we keep talking about. We need to find community. We need to find people who are like us, and we also need to find just different ways of viewing a situation. So figuring out if this systemic rage means that you want to attend a protest, a march, or if you just want to listen to a certain podcast or read something, or if you want to turn off the news or turn off social media. Those are all really wonderful things to do. So I think starting with like your action plan can really help, because it can help you feel like that system and that spiral that never ends, you can insert yourself into it to slow it down, or you can stop it momentarily.
Yeah. As well as like looking into and turning into your trauma responses, which are, you know, tied to, of course, we all have certain privileges that we are born with or that we come into in our life, and recognizing like, okay, for us, where we are seated right now, what is going to be best to regulate me, and then potentially use that to be able to say, okay, how can I advocate for others as well? You know, obviously we sit here knowing that we have some areas of privilege, of course.
Oh, for sure.
And so looking at that, sometimes we do have to take a step back, and sometimes we say, okay, we need to step in, and like being able to have that autonomy and decide like where you are currently is super important. And a lot of times that's forgotten. It's like always go, 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 go. But that's what causes burnout, and that's what causes that resentment of like, feel like I'm doing all of this and it's not helping, and that hopelessness. Whereas like sometimes you do have to take a second, fill your cup up, get ready so that you can give energy out to whatever it is that you're needing to address and advocate for.
Well, and I feel like that really brings up, and I think a really big key, and if you're experiencing like systemic rage, is safety. Because even the comment of like, women feeling like they have to explain why they're hypervigilant or they're constantly concerned about safety. I've obviously been there. You've been there. I don't really know of, I'm trying to think, I don't really know of a woman in my life who hasn't been there before. And I think that, so if you're thinking about that kind of rage specifically, you might hear us say things like, figure your action plan. And you might think like, oh, like I'll show them, I'll go outside without my keys, without my pepper spray, without my phone. That's not how we mean in terms of community and action plan. I think that when we're talking about systemic rage, prioritizing safety above everything else is going to be key. And that is psychological safety and physical safety, because there's so much validity and evidence behind being fearful. If you are a certain gender, if you express yourself in a certain way, or if you just go about the world in a specific fashion, there, of course, are safety concerns there. And that can vary across the world, truly. And so I do think this is idea of when you are wanting to confront these systemic feelings of rage, ensure your safety first and foremost. And it's like, you know what? I would love to have that anarchist idea of like, I'm going to go for a run at night without anything. But that wouldn't feel comfortable. That wouldn't feel right. And I also cannot continue to advocate for safety if I'm no longer here. That's actually something that I've had to catch myself, because I've been loving like going for like walks and runs with my dog as he's been a puppy. But with how late we work, I don't see the sun that much. And there's a lot of time where I have to tell my partner, like, I need you to come with me.
I gotta be outside. I gotta get fresh air. And like when you're leaving at 6, 7, it's getting dark by the time that you're home. And it's like, hey, well, I haven't had any air other than the one in my room today, so I've gotta get something.
And it's so easy to have that rage of like, I wish it wasn't like this. Absolutely. I definitely wish it wasn't like this. But in order to confront that rage, like we do have to ensure that we're safe first. And that does apply to like our psychological safety too. And knowing that if we are in a position where we're feeling like our mental health is not safe, if it is immediately threatened, we can't confront that rage if we are in fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big takeaway from this, is if your rage has reached that survival point and that instinct, we have to step away and get ourselves safe before we can even peel back those layers. So how would you recognize that you are in fight or flight?
Okay, so for me, typically when I'm in fight or flight, one, I start to cry. And I'm a shutdowner.
Okay.
So like I try and ignore and avoid, and I want to be by myself and hole up. And so I recognize that like when I stop talking to people, when I stop reaching out, when I stop talking in general, that's when I know like, okay, I'm in fight or flight right now, and I'm trying to protect myself. And that's typically coming from a lot of past relationships of feeling like, okay, I've got a guard because I'm not safe if I say anything right now. So for me, what I like to do to combat that when I'm like shutting down is I like to take the opposite reaction. Once I notice it, then I text at least 2 people and I start up a random conversation. And it could be about the topic. It could not be about the topic. Like, what about you? How do you know you're in fight or flight? And then what was your most recent rage moment?
Very similar, as I just completely withdraw. I definitely kind of go into my little shell pretty easily. And I think it happens without it. I don't even realize it. And so I usually like hear from my mom, and she's like, hey, like, where'd you go?
Good?
Like, are you okay? And I really appreciate that about her. And like when friends have done it once in a while, I'm so overwhelmed with gratitude for that, because I typically don't realize it till they say it. So I typically withdraw a lot. I typically embrace a lot of movement. Like my frequency of like exercise goes up a lot. But one of my favorite coping skills for rage is like heavy weightlifting. Really powerful. Really love it.
Pump some iron.
Oh, it feels incredible. Especially because like if you think about it, powerlessness, what better way to feel powerful
Lift something
than
heavy.
Lifting heavy stuff. Which is funny because like I have like rips in my hand from
Look
weights.
at you with your calluses.
I know. It only took like several years of doing this consistently.
Feminine rage.
But I saw it and I was like, yes.
Yeah.
But then I also checked myself and I was like, oh, things have been stressful lately. So I will say my most recent feelings of feminine rage was honestly the last few days came from our healthcare system. Without going too far into detail, I had something that was denied, which I do feel actually very strongly that it's like a basic human right. It actually does fall under my reproductive rights. So obviously this isn't like a political podcast, but it was something about like me standing by myself, just like my health status, trying to get that looked at and like evaluated, and it wasn't deemed as like medically necessary. And so I just got really frustrated with our healthcare systems. And to combat that, I appealed their denial. And the thing is, like, I think that's really helpful because I know we talked about it. Do I think my health insurance carrier is going to read my multiple page rebuttal, including sources, in APA format, I must say.
They should.
Yeah, never underestimate a highly educated woman, especially not a northern
Did you have a
woman.
works cited page?
I did.
Nice. So it's like organized for them.
Yes.
Very easy.
It is. And so I think that's how I wanted to fight back, because I felt so powerless in that moment, and I felt so small and like I didn't matter. And so I was like, you know what? I need to remind myself that I do matter, and this is why. And it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter if they read it, because not being covered is really expensive. But it's more of this kind of idea of my voice can still be heard and it's okay. So that was my most recent one. But I do think that when I think about systemic rage as a whole and rage as a whole, it brings up this idea of when people feel like their emotions are too big, what happens. And it's interesting that both of us, when we are in fight or flight, our emotions are as small as they possibly can be.
Yeah.
And I do think that a lot of the time, big feelings, especially ones of rage and anger, are swatted and told like you're not acceptable, or you can't be logical if you have a big feeling too. I think that's just one of my forever pieces of feminine rage, though, is people thinking that emotions are a weakness or that they don't have a place in productive or logic-based conversations.
No, I agree. Especially being therapists, it's like,
Yeah.
woo.
Right.
It's like a whole side of a discussion is the feelings around said. Because if you didn't have feelings around it, it probably wouldn't be a discussion.
Right. Well, and also, like, do feelings belong as the primary factor in every conversation? No, but they add context. And it's just like for us, most of our business decision-making processes have to involve feelings. Yeah. But like I'm thinking about people who work in like a very black and white field. Sure, their work will not involve feelings, but the trickle down might. And if you think about like human factors, marketing, advertising, like
based on feeling,
how
someone's gonna feel when they look at something. Yeah,
right.
So yeah, taking feeling completely out of all decision making, out of all life. It's like, okay, you just took something that's very gray and that brings in perspective and individuality to black and white, and we are all robots, which we are not.
And so I think that brings like, invite your rage to the table with you. Like invite the rage in. If you are experiencing it, first of all, sometimes we don't have a choice because it is a trauma response. It isn't that fight or flight or all the other F words you used
the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, fib.
Wow.
Fight, freeze, fawn, fib. Yeah.
We'll definitely have to make a post on that because I want to learn more about it. I only know fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So very interesting. But I think it's this idea of when we're in that super activated state where we think that rage is one of our top emotions that we're experiencing, invite it in, make sure we're safe, and then don't water yourself down. Don't make yourself smaller. Let that feeling fill you up, and then ask yourself what's below it and really start to peel it back and remind yourself that your rage is a communicator, just like anxiety is a big protector. Anxiety wants to keep us safe, make us do well, just like an Inside Out. The little green character was just trying to keep Riley safe. Yeah. Our anger is just trying to tell us something. I think it's inviting it to the table, peeling it back, and then being willing to listen.
Well, thanks for joining us for another, of course, remembering that this is not in lieu of therapy. And if you are in need of extra resources, join us on www.soulhavengeorgia.com. Yes. Check out Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, all the things, all the platforms. And then, of course, if you believe you are in immediate danger, feel free to call 988-911 or visit your local emergency room.
Keep on raging, my friends.
Woohoo!